Mark, many Christians do not want to talk about the age of the earth. And you told me that once you did your best to avoid this issue, but something happened, turning your timidity into boldness, to the point where now you talk on this subject to thousands of people around the world. What changed?
Well, Scott, I became a Christian at the age of just 10, and I grew up believing that, well, God must have used evolution to create. That seemed like a logical conclusion. I didn't really think too much about it. I went through my high school, university years, and but I had a lot of questions that I really couldn't answer. Basic questions like, why did Jesus die for me? Because it made no sense. And I used to reason, why couldn't Jesus have come to the earth, shown us how to live in relationship with our Heavenly Father, and then have been transfigured up into heaven? Why the agony of the cross? And I didn't understand it. And that's a pretty basic question for a young Christian, right? And consequently, I wasn't capable or confident in sharing my faith with others, because they might ask me the very same question and I couldn't answer. So then you look like you don't know what you're talking about, and I didn't want to go there.
Too late. Yes, the whole issue of Jesus being a scapegoat doesn't make any sense, and not just because it contradicts Deuteronomy, but because the concept of a scapegoat doesn't make any sense, because there's no reality in putting your sins, whatever the hell that is, into something else and then punishing an innocent for your crimes. And there's no reason for Jesus to sacrifice himself. Unconditional love means that there's no conditions. So he could just choose to forgive us for something he never should have been upset with us for. We didn't do anything wrong in the first place. And Jesus didn't really sacrifice himself either, because he was supposed to be dead, but only for 3 days, which means he wasn't really dead, was he? Because death is kind of permanent. It's kind of the whole point of being dead. It's nature's way of saying, shh, shut up. And Jesus wasn't even dead for 3 whole days. He wasn't even dead for 2 whole days. And then he gets to respawn. So what was the sacrifice? Jesus basically spent Easter weekend in hell, a place that he owns and controls, because it's not the devil that tortures us. The Bible says that Jesus is the one crushing the unbelievers in a bloody wine press. And what's the point of judging someone and torturing them forever over what or whether they believe? And what's the point of a merciless eternal torture when there's no rehabilitation, compensation, reparation, just mindless, merciless, and inexcusably excessive torture for no damned reason? Oh, but we're supposed to be talking about scientific evidence for why the earth can't be millions of years old. So this ought to be rich. Let's listen in.
So it was at the end of my postgraduate work, in fact, I was reading a book by Billy Graham called Peace with God. And in that book, Billy Graham has a chapter on sin. And in that chapter, he has words to the effect that Adam was no gibbering caveman. And in other words, he made a deliberate, conscious decision to rebel against God. And I just felt the question impressed on me, do you believe that? And I thought, yeah, I do believe that. And it was like a light went on. And I realized, well, if that's true, you can't have death and suffering before Adam's sin. And that means the whole evolutionary story is theologically impossible. So that started me on a real journey of discovery and reading. And I discovered that, hey, I could actually believe what the Bible actually said without having to, as it were, leave my brains at the church door,
If you didn't have to, then why did you?
And that was liberating for me.
So you're there, you're a young man, finished your postgraduate degrees, you're reading this book, and the realization that comes to you is that you can't have death before sin.
Yeah.
So how did that liberate you?
Well,
Because
it meant that I now understood, for instance, why Jesus died for me. Because the Bible actually makes it very clear in the New Testament that it was Adam's rebellion against God that brought suffering and death into the world. And that's why the last Adam came. He came to pay the price for the first Adam's rebellion. Now, until you link those two things together, you don't actually have a coherent basis for the gospel message.
And you still don't, because the Garden of Eden is obviously a parable, a fable with a moral, whose only possible truth is metaphorical, in which there are two trees, both magically enchanted, one blessed, one cursed. Now, first we have the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And if you eat that, then it doesn't make you evil. It means that you know what morality is. But all Abrahamic religions love to punish people eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. The other option in this illustrated choice is the fruit of the tree of eternal life. And having spent only one lifetime intently studying the first few chapters of Genesis, you might have missed where this tree was mentioned twice. Once in Genesis 2:9, and then again in Genesis 3:22, wherein God says that he has to yoink Adam out of the garden, lest he reach his hand out and also eat of the fruit of the tree of life. Because if he did that, then he would live forever, which means that he wouldn't have lived forever otherwise. Adam was already mortal before he sinned. Now, why else would there be a tree of life in this fable? Death already existed because humans are animals, meaning that we have to ingest and digest other organisms in order to survive. And the story acknowledges that they had to eat. So what if Adam never ate from either tree? What if he never ate anything at all?
And that really was my challenge as a young Christian. I hadn't made that link. It was challenging then because I discovered that, hang on a minute, I'm now confronting the belief system of the very culture in which I live, which of course is in the millions of years of death, struggle and suffering before mankind even appears.
Got you. So before that point, you would have said, hey, I'm a Christian, but I believe in the millions and billions of years. I believe in evolution. Is that correct?
Yeah, sort of. I avoided it though.
Yeah.
And I kept my head down. I certainly didn't share my faith with people. As I said, I wasn't game because I didn't understand it.
Yes.
I mean, how can you confidently share with someone something that you don't actually understand?
Yes.
And that was my problem.
And it still is. You don't know anything about the science. You don't even understand your own theology. I'm going to skip most of this meaningless theological nonsense because we're supposed to be talking about science, and these guys prattle on for like a half hour or so before getting to anything relevant.
And so what you're saying is the age of the earth is critical to you having the boldness to share the gospel. And so far we've just covered, well, you saw the problem, and the problem was we can't have death before sin. And so that's an issue theologically, that's an issue for the gospel, because why did Jesus come if there's, like, he came to abolish death?
Absolutely. But the thing is, the millions of years always place death before Adam.
Right.
So if you have death before Adam, you don't have a meaningful gospel message to share. So that means the millions of years actually undercuts the gospel. And that was a revelation to me.
Well, so much for the gospel. It's all based on already falsified folklore anyway.
Yeah, got you. So there's the theology, or what the Bible says to be plainly true, means that you should believe it. But then also there's a lot of scientific evidence that points to this actually being true. But certainly that's not what we hear, Mark. We hear the contrary.
We do indeed.
Yeah,
and I hadn't heard any evidence to the contrary either at that stage of my life.
You just heard the evidence for the millions and billions of years for evolution. Right. You'd not heard the evidence for creation.
It's in the textbooks. It's on the TV documentaries. Where do you find out the evidence for that supports the biblical account of history?
Nowhere, because it doesn't exist. They never get to it. In this entire conversation where they talk about presenting evidence for a young earth, they never present any because there isn't any. But the more important thing to observe here is what this guy just said. He had seen the evidence for evolution in museums, in textbooks, and all over the place, but he rejected it anyway. So he's seen the evidence and he rejects it. But he never saw any evidence for creationism at all. That's what he said. He'd never seen any evidence for creationism, but he believes it anyway. I want to point this out for all those people who like to pretend as if faith is based on evidence. No, this guy believes what is not evidently true, and he rejects the evidence of what is true.
So I want to get now into how we determine the age of something and what some of the arguments are on both sides.
Spoiler alert, they don't ever get to the arguments on both sides. They only have erroneous arguments for their own side. But fortunately, I'm here, and I know both sides of this issue better than they know their own alone.
So I guess I'll ask you that question first. How do we determine the age of something?
Well, I know my age because I've got a document at home called a birth certificate, which thankfully my
25,
parents
right?
found, but just a shade more. Yeah, actually. I'm glad you said that, Scott. And so I have an historical record. Now, there is no scientific experiment you can conduct on my body, not that I would let you, to determine my age. So making observations in the present actually can't permit you to determine an age.
What a surprise. The very first testable thing he says, and it's wrong. Now, there are lots of ways to determine the age of a human body or of geologic formations, like rocks, for example.
Can I just pick you up on that? But
Sure.
we could guess, right? There would be your cells. Would they be
Yes.
slightly different to a baby's
Oh,
cells?
sure.
But I think your
Get
point
a
here-
rough estimate, but you can not with any precision is my point.
Right, yeah, got
Right?
you.
You
Yeah.
certainly couldn't determine that I was born on the 24th of October in 18 something. No, it wasn't that far ago. So if you want an accurate, now a lot of the ages we see for things like rocks and fossils are given with extraordinary precision. So much precision that you think, wow, these scientists are, they're really on top of their game. They know this stuff really well.
So, Jonathan Baker, Dr. Jonathan Baker, would you once again introduce yourself, give your credentials, as it were, for this discussion?
Sure. I'm a geologist by training. I've got my bachelor's, master's, and PhD in geoscience with an emphasis on geochemistry. And so I mainly study the isotope geochemistry of sediments and cave samples, which we use to reconstruct climates. So I'm always interested in dating rocks to figure out how old they are, because that helps us figure out when these climatic changes happened in the past. And it's unfortunately quite relevant right now.
So you do radiometric dating yourself. You understand the process. You've done it. You're a paleoclimatologist, so you're not just dealing with the age of the rocks, which, by the way, that's the name of your channel, is Age of Rocks. But you're also dealing with climate changes that are evident in the age of rocks. So you would be as close to an expert as we can get in an instance like this.
I mean, who could argue with them? But it's interesting when you peel the layers back, because you can't actually measure age.
Right.
So a scientist measures the physical and chemical properties of his sample, but you can't measure the age.
Mm.
So what they do typically is measure a process or a rate, something which is happening and can be observed in the present. And then they wind it backwards to determine when it might have begun. Now, that's a principle called the uniformitarian principle. So what's happening today is what has been happening for time immemorial. And if we can measure this rate, we just go backwards and find the commencement. So that's very fundamental. It is a principle which has really dictated the conclusions of geology now for a couple of 100 years.
Mm.
Now, the problem with that is that you can't actually make observations in the past. Science only works in the present, because we've only got the present. We don't have the past at all. Perhaps I could give you an example.
Yeah.
Let me use this glass of water. I'll try not to spill it on my laptop. So I've got some water in this.
Yep.
And let's imagine that this was sitting underneath a dripping tap.
Okay.
Now, if I measured the rate at which the tap is dripping,
Yep.
and then I measured the volume of water in the cup, I could calculate how long the cup has been under the tap, right?
So you've got the dripping rate, and then you've got the volume that's in the cup.
Yep.
And then you just say, well, okay, the volume, and you've got the dripping rate, you can calculate the age.
Yeah.
Is-
Sounds pretty straightforward,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
But let's imagine now that you've only just discovered this cup under the tap. You've walked into the kitchen and there it is.
Yeah.
You didn't see the cup put under the dripping tap.
Okay.
So to be able to work out how long the cup's been there, you've had to make some assumptions. What kind of assumptions do you think you would have to make?
Well, I guess you have to assume the cup was empty to start with.
Absolutely, but you don't know because you weren't there.
True. And are you saying that's similar with the rock? I guess that's how they do the-
Absolutely. You
So-
also don't know that the tap's been dripping at the same rate.
True. Yeah.
Okay.
You only measure in the present, as you
The
were saying
present,
before.
that's right. So if someone had turned the tap on hard, partly filled up the cup, turned the tap off carelessly, left it dripping and then walked away
Got
just
you.
seconds before you came into the kitchen.
Yeah. I've got a much slower dripping rate now, and I'm going to estimate
Exactly.
a very big age when actually it was dripping much faster in the past.
Yeah.
So it would have been, so it's a much younger
Yes,
full cup
that's
than
right.
than I
Exactly.
realized. And so you're saying some of the processes they use work on this principle.
Well, I'm just trying to draw the analogy, right? So that would be applying uniformitarianism to take the volume of water, divide by the drip rate, hey presto, we get the age. So you can think of radiometric dating, for instance, of working a little bit like that. You have a radioactively unstable element called a parent element that decays at a certain rate to produce what's called the daughter element. So if you can measure the ratio of the parent element to the daughter element in your sample, and knowing the rate of decay, you can then calculate the age of the sample. But you're measuring the process in the present, you're measuring the volume of parent element and daughter element in the present, but you don't know the initial conditions, how much parent and how much daughter were in the sample to begin with. Maybe some parent element has been added to or removed from the sample in the past, same with the daughter element. In fact, there are something like 7 independent assumptions you have to make to be able to determine the age of your sample based on measurements in the present.
Wow. And so is there anything that can ratify those assumptions, or is there any way that we can see that those assumptions are correct assumptions? Because I guess I'm asking, is there a way of calibrating this clock? Because this is really important what you're saying, because when people think about the age of the earth and it's a stumbling block for Christianity and the biblical history of the earth, it's mainly to do with radiometric dating is the main thing I hear.
It is, that's right. Radiometric dating is held up as the like an absolute dating method.
Yes.
Which gives billions of years if you use certain processes like uranium, lead, or potassium argon, and so on. There are quite a number of them.
And what you're describing is not an absolute method. It's a relative method that depends on the assumptions.
Well, it's a method which is rife with assumptions.
Okay,
so it's probably not a relative method. Relative dating would apply to things like layers of rock above or below another layer of rock.
Okay, yeah.
In which case you would reasonably assume the layer on top was deposited after the layer below.
Yes.
Although even then, that's not necessarily true, because sometimes layers are laid down by horizontal transport of a slurry of different particle sizes and so on. But let's not go there for the minute.
Yeah.
So it's put forward as an absolute dating method.
Yes.
But it is based on assumptions.
Yeah. So what we're talking about now is that there was the creation.com comes out with a video talk about how there's scientific evidence to prove that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And I was real keen to see, well, what scientific evidence could that be? And if the first of the articles, or the first of the items listed, was that that radiometric dating is rife with assumptions. You respond to that?
That's really the nature of science. Any formulaic mathematical equations that you're dealing with have assumptions intrinsic to them, and that's okay. It doesn't undermine anything. That's just part of how we gain more knowledge. Assuming this is the so if we assume this property stays constant, then the result should look like X. And if we find that it doesn't look like X, then we can go back and check those assumptions. And so through the scientific method, we don't just leave those assumptions unchecked, unverified. We state them clearly up front so that anybody out there knows to test our claims. These are the potential underpinnings that you could uncheck, right? And so, having assumptions as part of the equation is nothing new. I mean, you should know this from middle school mathematics class and physics class. When we talk about assuming this, then here's the results. And if that assumption is incorrect, then we get a different result. So
what you're talking about, because you leave open that the assumption could be incorrect. And this would be the difference between a belief system and an investigation, which is what science is. In an investigation, you don't commit to a single hypothesis and only find data that supports that and ignore everything else, which is what the creationists are doing. They have assumptions, they're rife with assumptions, but they're unquestioned assumptions. They have to follow the one hypothesis that cannot be falsified, where we are weighing multiple hypotheses at once, and we can intermittently, okay, so if we assume X, then in this instance, we would look for this, or this. But if we assume that this one is true, then what would we test for? And so we're able to objectively evaluate both sides and other options when available, or even when there's not available. Is this thing true or not? Or do we need to find another answer if there is another answer? And maybe we don't know the answer yet, but we'll know whether this is the answer or not. Right? This is the way that we can test things. So the assumptions are tentative and provisional. They're not unquestioned.
Right. And it's, again, something that we use in everyday applications. If you read the newspaper and somebody made a poll of who America wants to be the next president, intrinsic to that poll result is the assumption that their sampling was random. Intrinsic to that is that the population follows some normal distribution, depending on what they're asking about. And otherwise, those poll results could be incorrect, or the implications could be inaccurate, right? When we send something into space, launch a satellite, you have assumptions about what the air resistance is going to be on the path out to orbits. And if that assumption doesn't hold, then you have to make a correction, and you find that your initial trajectory is going to be wrong. And so the fact that those assumptions are there doesn't mean that we just abandon statistics, we abandon astrophysics and engineering and everything else. No, this is what makes the job interesting, that you can always check those. So yes, when it comes to radiometric dating, each model or each technique that we might use has its intrinsic assumptions. But again, those are clearly stated, and we've developed over many decades now ways to test those assumptions independently.
Yes.
Now, what happens when you get a date that doesn't fit what you expect to get? So let me give you an illustration. Let's say that when you've walked into this kitchen with our dripping tap in the cup, someone says to you, "Oh, I saw that cup put under the tap 45 minutes ago."
Okay. And then you've got
So
something.
now you know the answer. How long has the cup been? It's been there for 45 minutes, irrespective of drip rates and volumes of water. Okay. So you might think, when I calculate it based on drip rates and volumes of water, I get much longer than 45 minutes. So
Are you sure about that 5 minutes? I may have been mistaken. I got no more use for this guy.
how do I make it fit? Well, okay, maybe there was a different amount of water in the cup. Maybe the drip rate was different. So you adjust your assumptions to make your scientific calculation fit what the historical record tells you. Can you see the difference? So it's the historical record which actually determines how long the cup's been under the tap, or if you like, the age of your rock or your fossil. Now, here's the catch. What do you assume is the age?
Well, that depends. Do we have a measurement for it, or just someone's vague estimation?
And the assumption, in the case of the evolutionary story, is based on what people believe.
Well, you might have heard of the concept of psychological projection, where a person basically projects onto others something that isn't necessarily there.
So if you begin with a belief that says, I have to explain this universe without God, I'm forced into a naturalistic explanation because I cannot admit a supernatural creator into the equation. So when I have a naturalistic process and a model, that's the evolutionary story, I've got to have deep time, as it's called, the billions of years, to even have a ghost of a chance of explaining the extraordinary complexity and diversity of living things, for instance, that we see in the world around us. So the millions of years become a complete non-negotiable for the naturalistic explanation. So when you get an age, if it doesn't fit your millions of years, well, obviously the assumptions have to be adjusted so that it does fit.
When you test the assumption, then the assumption necessarily might change, right? As indicated by further study?
Yeah, so we can develop a method to test an assumption independently, and we might find that the assumption held, as far as we can tell, and so there's no reason to doubt the model results. However, we might find that the assumption did not hold for a specific case, in which case the results do not tell us, for example, the age of the mineral that we're dating. And even if we test an assumption, it doesn't mean it's no longer an assumption. And there is a tendency, I think, in these discussions to use the word assumption in a colloquial sense. Assumption doesn't mean something you think it's right and you never question it, you never check it or verify it. It's synonymous with a belief, arbitrary belief about the system. And that's just not what that means. But yes, we could find that it changed. And sometimes those are the more interesting examples when it comes to radiometric dating. He does list some basic assumptions, like we assume that the parent and daughter product amounts are known, that the decay rate is constant, that the system remained closed, and we might find a way to check independently whether our system remained closed, find that it didn't, and sometimes that can be a more interesting result than the simple system that we think about, because it could tell us, well, the system stopped being closed at this point in time, and so we don't just have a date for the age of the mineral and when it formed, but maybe a date for when this mountain range got uplifted and the temperature rose a substantial amount, or the pressure rose, and that caused the system to become open, right? And so this is almost as often used in radiometric dating, those instances where the assumptions did not hold, and they're quite informative. To give an example from something that I've worked on, we look at speleothems or stalagmites, and these form out of calcium carbonate inside of caves. And so, yes, they contain carbon, which means technically you can use the radiocarbon method to date them. One of the assumptions in the radiocarbon method is, of course, that we know that the initial radiocarbon amount, and typically that derives, say, from the atmosphere. If you're looking at, say, a piece of a tree or something that got its carbon from the atmosphere, and so the radiocarbon content of that tree is going to be equal to roughly whatever the atmosphere was at the time, and then it decays. But if you're looking at a cave deposit, maybe half of that comes from the atmosphere, half of that carbon, and the other half comes from bedrock, which has been sitting around for a really long time, so it doesn't have any radiocarbon. So the assumption that that parent-daughter ratio is known is false, and we know that it's false, but we still use the radiocarbon method to date speleothems, not to tell us how old they are. To do that, we use the uranium and thorium system, but we look at how wrong the radiocarbon age. We look at how wrong that radiocarbon age is, to help us understand how much of that carbon was coming from the atmosphere versus other sources. So over time, we can use radiocarbon dating to tell us about the system itself, the carbon cycle local to that cave, which could be a function of climate or something else. And so here we have an assumption that's disproven. We know it's wrong, but still this technique gives us more information in the end. And we can do this too by combining the two radiometric dating techniques, using the radium series system and the radiocarbon system at the same time.
The way I envision this in my amateur naivete is I'm picturing like an old ham radio operator, and he's got a couple of dials, and then figuring out how to work. You turn the dial this way, and you turn the squelch this way, and there's a couple of different things that you can hone in on to get the precision, to get clarity. And that's what I think of the last 100 years or so. This is what radiometric dating has been doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's gotten quite creative. And although you have this basic set of assumptions to radiometric dating that everybody learns in physics class or geology intro class, not every technique has that same set of assumptions, right? It's not always an assumption that the daughter product was 0 at time equals 0. Sometimes in other methods, we don't assume that at all. We use some independent proxy to measure indirectly what that initial ratio was. And so when you combine multiple techniques again, for example, a potassium-argon age with a argon-argon isochron, one of them assumes that there was no argon at the start. The other one doesn't assume that. It measures it indirectly. So when you put those together, you not only know the age of the sample, but you know the nature of how it formed when it did, and how much argon was incorporated at time equals 0, how much of that argon is tightly bound in the mineral structure, and how much of it is loosely bound, and all sorts of other things. So, putting this all together, we've got a very intricate interwoven system so that those assumptions get checked from multiple angles. And that's not something you'll ever see in the approaches that folks like this take.
So you said earlier that if someone told you, hey, the cup was placed under there 45 minutes ago, you've got your answer.
Yeah.
And you're saying that is what a written record is. And so really, are you saying the only way we can truly determine an age is if we have someone that observed it at the time?
I think that's exactly right.
Yep.
And the best possible historical record is a written record from the eyewitness.
So Homer's Odyssey, the Avestas of Zarathustra, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Bhagavad Gita are all a matter of historically accurate fact, according to this guy.
And I guess that's how we determine most of written history. And people talk about events very conclusively that happened, 500, 2,000 years ago. And then we go into not just written history, but I guess it's archaeological history. Is that correct?
Yes. And we can confirm various dates and events with reasonable precision.
But then written history, how far does it go back?
Well, there is the question. In fact, what you've got to is at the nub of the issue.
Yes.
You see, the earliest written record we have, we find in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it says on that first day, created the earth, light and darkness were separated, day and night, there was one day.
Yes.
So that's the very beginning, and that's when the written record of history commences.
What absolute nonsense. No, the earliest syllabic texts are Mesopotamian, polytheistic. They include the Sumerian king list and the collective cuneiform tablets in Ashurbanipal's library. And none of them mention the Jewish God because these are all more than 1,000 years older than the book of Genesis.
Now, people say, oh, but hang on a minute, there was nobody there then. And yes, but God was there, and he is the eyewitness of what he did in that creation week when he was speaking the universe into being.
No, God wasn't there. Your God wasn't invented until relatively recently. Every book of the Hebrew Bible was written by people who weren't there and who didn't know what they were talking about. Biblical history scholars say that Genesis was composed thousands of years too late, and that it was based largely on previously pagan mythology, for which we have a historic record going back way beyond the time of the flood that we know never happened, because the historical record remains continuous in multiple cultures.
So that's the eyewitness, reliable, written record.
Fantasy, folklore, myths, and legends.
Written through the agency of human hands, yes, but inspired and guided by God's Holy Spirit to write only what was true.
Surely you can't be serious.
It was overall, what's the word I'm looking for?
Stupid?
So stupid.
I don't know how Leonard can get so caught up in this.
It's crazy. They spend hours arguing about things that don't even exist.
So it was Moses that wrote the first 5 books, the Pentateuch?
Well, he was the editor and writer.
Okay.
Yeah. So there may well have been written documents that he had available to him.
Interesting.
Which he would have integrated into what's called the Pentateuch now, the first 5 books of the Bible.
Historians and archaeologists have both given up on a historical Moses, but even when they thought there might still have been a Moses, they already knew that he didn't write the Pentateuch.
So is it possible that God told Adam what he did and he wrote it down and it got passed down the generations through Noah? What's your
Seems
thoughts?
perfectly reasonable to me. They walked and talked in the garden, the Bible says. I can imagine Adam saying, so God, how did you create the stars? And what about this tree? How did you make that? And I could just think it would have been just amazing.
Even Christian biologists admit that Adam and Eve were genetically impossible and certainly did not exist. We know for sure that the Garden of Eden is man-made mythology with not even a kernel of truth to that tale.
And Adam, remember, was a perfect man.
Yes.
No flaws, no faults. He had a perfect intellect, phenomenal capacity, the like of which we just don't see today.
Yes.
But the problem is our thinking is so influenced by the evolutionary concepts. We think of the patriarchs as having swung out of the trees. But instead, they were giants of intellect, and we're just a pale reflection, I think, of what they would have been.
Yeah.
No, I've read the Bible too. And those characters, Abraham, Lot, Joshua, Jacob, Job, they were all obviously idiots, every one of them.
So I've heard it two ways. I've heard that Adam could have passed this down through the generations and then it got to Moses, or that God could have revealed it to Moses. But either way, the eyewitness was still there because it was God.
Yeah.
Do you have a preference on those conclusions? Is there
No, I think that sounds great. You see, in fact,
either way?
you can go. I think both.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry,
but
yes,
a bit of both.
I think both.
Interesting.
You have the early records are passed down. Now, it turns out that Noah's father, Lamech, was 56 years old when Adam died. So it's quite possible the record, the information, I'm quite sure they would have had writing right from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Went from Adam to Lamech to Noah, survived the flood, and Shem, Noah's son, was alive when Abraham was alive.
Who would win in a fight if Galactus fought the Hulk, or if Thor fought Iron Man?
Wow.
So you don't get many steps. It's not like you have the Chinese whispers problem for thousands of generations. Not like that at all. Very few.
Just a few generations.
Yeah, very
and
few.
Then you're at Moses.
Imagination.
It isn't real.
Interesting. So we're talking about the ages of things, and we've said that written history, most people agree on written history when you talk about the birth date of Dr. Mark Harwood, when you talk about when World War II started, maybe even when the Roman Empire was, and further back. People tend to agree roughly on Egyptian history, for example. I know there's some discrepancies. But what we're saying is you don't go much further back, and you get the start of all written history, and that was biblical written history.
No, there were other ancient cultures that already had libraries of histories and fantasy folklore millennia before the earliest books of the Bible, which did not include the Pentateuch, nor Job either, but rather Amos and Hosea, and even they are no older than about the 8th century BCE, which is about half as old as Christians say that the Exodus is supposed to be. In the time that creationists say that Moses existed, there were many other religions that were already ancient, but rabbinic Judaism didn't yet exist.
But some people want to believe that we can go much further back than that. And the way they need to do that is through these radiometric dating methods, which you talked about having a number of assumptions.
Yes. But assumptions that are driven by an initial belief.
Yes.
About the process of creation.
Yes.
Once again, it comes down to projection. Creationists lying and denying and pretending as if scientists are the ones doing what only creationists do.
Okay, so for the evolutionist, then, person who believes in evolution, the deep time, the millions and millions of years, is an integral part of that whole story.
Yes. If you don't have that amount of time, you don't have time for
evolution to have taken place.
You can't have an ape turning into a man in just 1,000 years. It needs millions of years.
Well, not even that's enough, as it turns out, but
Yeah.
that's what they think.
Except that humans are apes, both physically and genetically, by definition and derivation, in the same way that a dachshund is a dog and a lion is a cat. How long do you think it takes for a dog to evolve into a dachshund?
That's right.
Yeah.
But it's based on a belief.
That's another lie. No, it isn't. Our understanding of evolution or deep time or pretty much anything in reality is based on volumes of data that caused pioneer scientists to give up their beliefs. It forced them to change their minds, wherein they learned to investigate without depending on a prior belief, the way science denying religious fundamentalists do. So this guy is projecting his own faults onto scientists because every conservative accusation is a confession of what they've been doing all along.
Yes.
And the important thing is that the belief begins with the assumption you must explain everything in natural terms.
Yes.
And the reason is that they reject the supernatural.
Mm.
So if you reject the supernatural, it's the same as saying, well, there is no God.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, is an atheistic belief.
Mm.
So the deep time and evolutionary position is in fact based on an a priori belief that rejects God.
He says that we assume naturalism because we arbitrarily reject the supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
How would you react to that, or would you?
Well, I would. I think it's important, and the basic philosophy of science is something that's, every grad student should learn to some extent, and it comes into practice because you're working with people of very different backgrounds, including different faith backgrounds. And for us, we don't simply assume naturalism. We might assume natural factors and say, like, well, if all of this happened according to natural processes which we describe through various physical laws and such, then this is how the system should function. And these are the results that we should get. And we can't scientifically exclude some deviation from that, whether it's miraculous or anything else. But at the same time, we recognize we can't investigate the metaphysical scientifically, and so we leave that to a different realm entirely,
So
right?
if you're a Christian and
Mhm.
you're doing studies or whatever, you're not a biblical literalist necessarily, but you're a Christian. You believe in God, all of that.
Mhm.
Maybe you're Muslim, maybe you're Hindu, whatever. But you believe in God and you believe in the supernatural, but you know that you can't test that. There's no way that you can falsify that. So you also can't trust anything that you can't test, because the old idea that we don't believe something, we fail to disprove it.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we have whatever's supported by evidence, whatever's not doesn't get discussed. So
Mhm.
in science, we can't promote what doesn't get supported.
Right. And again, it's not something we can test for because, for example, if there's a deviation from these natural processes described by physical laws, we can't know if that's, let's say, an anomaly in our equipment, or if this sudden spike in intensity on the mass spectrometer had to do with like angels fighting with each other and that we can't see. Like, I mean, we can admit that that's a possibility, while also saying that we can't investigate that. We can't say scientifically whether it's even more probable than another outcome, right? And
Yeah, you're
again,
more generous than me. I wouldn't admit that that was a possibility.
well, so I
I
would
mean,
say
I think
it's
we have to have certain criteria. If we're going to say that something is possible, there has to be a. How do you know that it's possible? There has to be a precedent or a parallel or a verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. It isn't possible just because, well, I don't know, anything's possible because I'm dumb.
I guess I mean it more in the latter sense. If it will say that anything's possible, we could be wrong about all this, and yeah, maybe it was a sudden surge in the building power supply, but maybe it was some demonic force. Like, but the root of this is that, pragmatically speaking, yes, we can work together, people of various faiths and non-faiths, in this system because we proceed on what we call this methodological naturalism, and we don't have to give up any philosophical tenets or even faith tenets that we might have individually in order to do this uh, collaboratively, right? So that makes the science effective. It means it can progress across cultural and religious boundaries and be successful as it is. And that's why we have this explosion in information. So it's simply false, though, to state that we just assume naturalism, or that we exclude the miraculous. And there are plenty of colleagues of mine, past and present, who would not, in principle, exclude the possibility of miracles altering how nature works, or something changing in the past that's very different from now, or some divine intervention. Like, they don't exclude that. They're open to that entirely. But they're not going to accept that just because it's a possibility out there, or even because it might comport with their faith, right? They still, I mean, we would still proceed on the presumption that this happens the way that we can describe it, until we find evidence otherwise.
That's interesting because mostly people would say that we're not coming to it from a scientific position. It's a faith position because we have to ignore the evidence.
Arguments from authority are that if your assumed authority says a thing, then that thing remains true even when the facts prove them wrong. Whereas science deals more with degrees of certainty, I would say, rather than absolute certainty.
Sure. The best way to measure that, I think, is through corroboration. And so if you argue that something is evidence for a claim, then you find an independent means by which to test that same claim, and you corroborate it or disprove it in that process, right? So that's how any sense of authority is overcome. And sure, it's difficult, especially in academia. You're budding graduate students, and you're up against emeritus professors who have done this their entire lives, and you can still have these conversations because it ultimately comes down to what are the results of your hypothesis testing, and so you can push back against the experts, or those who have more expertise than you, if you have sufficient evidence or lines of evidence that corroborate each other. And so that's really how we determine this confidence level.
But I think what you're saying is that this isn't evidence, it's a measurement made based on assumptions. And if you change those assumptions, then you change your interpretation.
Well, that's right. Well, here's the thing. You can change the assumptions around your dating methods and get any age you like, depending on the assumptions you make.
No, you can't, because we have many different methods that all come back with their own numbers. And these are not numbers that we got to make up, and they're numbers that concord with all of the other numbers from all of the other systems. So again, this guy is projecting his own dishonesty. This is what he does. And you're going to hear that in just a moment.
But the worst thing is you can't test any of those assumptions because they're all in the past.
Yes.
And we don't have the past.
Yes.
All we have is the present.
Now, he did say something that, that this is an important point. He said that we can't test our assumptions with regard to radiometric dating because they're all in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But my thought on this, and I'd like to get your opinion on it, is that it's not that somebody did a test and concluded this thing running this way with these assumptions, this is how old this thing is. It was a whole bunch of somebody's running a whole bunch of different tests for every strata in every geologic every geologic exposure in every geographic location all around the world for decades, and that all of these thousands of measurements taken everywhere around the world have produced wonderfully detailed geologic maps that the multi-billion-dollar fossil fuel industry depends upon.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have all of these different things, that different methods of radiometric dating, along with other forms of dating that are not necessarily radiometric, but all of these things all concord, especially now that we've understood, or that you've understood how to refine this, refine that. Now we've got a clear message, and we can do the same with all of these other processes. And looking down, now we get the same clear signal from everything we do everywhere in the world. The same thing constant. No, I would say that was testing the assumption. Would you not?
I would. And the way we test assumptions about what might have happened in the past is through the potential implications for our present observations. For example, we assume that the decay rates are constant when we use these model techniques to interpret the age of a mineral. And if we have no reason to believe that they were different in the past, we've observed as many conditions as we can to see that they don't vary appreciably in the present. But let's say they did change. If they did, say, accelerate by 1,000,000-fold, which some creationists are keen to suggest, then we wouldn't have a rock to analyze. I mean, that's an easy way to test that assumption. We know it didn't accelerate by 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 times because the rock is still there. And there's no evidence that it heated up to the degree that it would. I mean, it would have heated up from that excess decay to the point of melting or vaporizing the rock, but it's still there. So that couldn't have happened. We can also measure something by multiple methods. And so if the decay rate of uranium changed, then our uranium ages and our potassium ages, or rubidium strontium ages, they all might be very different now. Or disagree with each other in a certain way. But because they don't, we can be confident in that assumption that those decay rates didn't vary appreciably in the past. And so, yeah, that's how we test these assumptions in the past, by what their implications would be on our present observations.
And so I guess the conclusion out of all of that is the only reliable source of age information is an historical eyewitness account of what actually happened. And I believe that's what we have in God's word, the Bible, right from the very beginning.
Except that you don't have God's word. You have the words of mere fallible men who didn't agree with each other and obviously had no idea what they were talking about.
Okay, so let me ask you, how old is the Earth?
Okay, so let's apply that principle. The historical record actually tells us.
Yep.
Tells us that God created everything in 6 days. Adam was created on the 6th day of creation. It tells us that Adam was 130 years old when his son Seth was born, and Seth was 105 when his son Enos was born, and they're all the way down to Noah. And it says in the 600th year of Noah's life, the flood took place. You can just add those numbers up. They're all there in Genesis chapter 5.
Yep.
And if you add those numbers up that way, you end up with Noah's flood happening between the 5th and 6th Egyptian dynasties, just after the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, around the reign of Sargon of Akkad. So again, the written historical record proves that this interpretation of the Bible is wrong.
You don't have to be a rocket scientist to do it. It's straightforward. In fact, I get my grandchildren to do it as an exercise when they get to their 10th birthday. I'll sit down and we build a timeline of Bible history.
Wow.
And you'll discover that the flood occurred 1,656 years after the creation. And then you can follow on and discover that Abraham was born about 2,000 years after the creation. From Abraham to Jesus is about 2,000 years. We know that scripturally and also from history. And from the time of Jesus to the present day is about 2,000 years. So if you add those up, according to the Bible, and this is not my idea, here we are about 6,000 years after the creation. Now that's a bombshell. I mean, 6,000 years? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, most people would say that.
Yes.
Yeah, you're a real rocket surgeon.
And look, I've got to be honest, when I realised that, it really did take my breath away. And I had to say, wow, Lord, there's got to be some evidence of that. But you know there is.
Yes.
There's enormous amounts of evidence for a recent creation.
Yes.
It's just that people don't know about it. But that's the sort of thing which is on our website.
So you're not going to show us any of this evidence?
It feels like a big claim, and it feels like, well, a big claim, it needs some big support.
Absolutely.
So could you give us some of those? I mean, obviously people can go to the website and they can find out those.
Sure.
Creation.com/age, was it? Or 101?
Yeah. Creation.com/age.
Age, and you can go and see a whole list there.
101 evidences.
Could you just give us a few of them to start us off?
Absolutely. Look, there are various classes of evidence. There are those which show discordant results with the evolutionary timescales. And then there are those which point closer to just a matter of a few thousand years for Earth history. Now, in the former category, I would think, well, let's take some radiometric dating things first. And maybe might be worth just spending a little bit of time on that, because radiometric dates get so much weight put on them in our culture. So what you can do is test how good the dating methods are. Now, in order to do that, you need to have a rock of known age.
So that takes the assumptions away, like earlier we were saying.
Absolutely. So now you've got
minutes.
your historical record, you see. You know when this rock was formed. How do you get a rock of known age?
Yeah.
Well, a really good way is to take a rock from the lava dome of a volcano with a known eruption date.
Got it. It's just been solidified, so you know someone saw it. It's a historical record.
That's right. So there's an historical record with a date. So we now know exactly how old the rock is. So people have taken rocks from the lava dome, for instance, of Mount St. Helens. It erupted in 1980. And a rock from the lava dome was dated, various samples, using the potassium-argon dating method. And people got anywhere from 350,000 years to 2.8 million years old.
Wow, and it was only 1980.
Well, yes, and the rocks at the time were about 10 years old.
Oh, right. So interesting.
And you read in the literature, people say things like, well, dating rocks that are young is notoriously difficult. So now just hang on a minute. Let's just think through that. I've just given you a rock to date. And you're telling me that a young rock is very hard to date, but I don't know if it's young or old. I just know I've got a rock. I want you to tell me, is it young or old? So it's an interesting admission to make, isn't it?
Yeah.
That the dating laboratories themselves say, oh, well, it's pretty hard to date young rocks. But the point is, you shouldn't get such an extraordinary range of very old ages for something which is known to be much younger.
Yeah, got you. So I guess they're kind of saying, hey, look, the amount of daughter element is going to be very low because it's so young. But what you're saying is, well, hang on, surely shouldn't you get the lower end of your range?
Well, yes.
And not this range, because it's 350,000 years to 2.5 million.
And it should be within your error bars of performing the measurement.
Yeah, and they give error bars with these things
Absolutely.
as well. And so
any competent dating laboratory will do exactly that.
Yeah, wow.
So there are a number of others. There's a couple of volcanoes in Hawaii, Kilauea and Hualalai, each of which erupted approximately 200 years ago. Various ranges of ages, anywhere from up to 22 million years, or one was dated between 160 million and 3.3 billion years old, and they're about 200 years old.
So people have done this a lot. It sounds like, I mean, they must be creationists that are going to these sites and they take the rock samples and they send them away to laboratories.
Yeah, but it's not only creationists. I mean, the geologists want to know the ages.
Yes.
And they come across a lava flow somewhere, and they send it off to be dated, usually potassium argon for the lava flows. They want to have confidence that these results are good. But if you get unreliable results for things that have a known age, how can you have confidence in the results you get for things of unknown age?
Yeah.
So there's a fundamental dilemma there.
Waiting for him to finally get to this evidence, because he says there's so much evidence that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. And so we finally get to it. And what is the evidence that I've been waiting a half hour now for him to? It's that the Bible says so. He then says that there's an enormous amount of evidence that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, and he starts that list, his list of 101 evidences. I don't know why they pluralized the plural like that, but he says the first one that he mentioned was one that you and I have talked about before, where a pair of creationists had deliberately fudged their results regarding a random rock taken from Mount St. Helens, which they then improperly and incorrectly processed. Can you again explain what happened with that?
But there's something else you can do. You can test different dating methods on things which must be about the same age. So let me give you an example. In Queensland, there's a mine where about 20-something metres down, a drilling discovered a basalt layer from a lava flow, and it had passed through a forest, and there was charred wood still there. So the basalt was dated using potassium argon at 45 million years. The wood was carbon dated at something like 45,000 years, a factor of 1,000 different, but they must be at the same age because the lava has flowed through the forest.
Wow.
So you would think different dating methods should give about the same results. Now, people will say, yeah, but hang on, carbon dating can't go back millions and millions of years. But it gave a date well within the range of its capability and precision. So it should have at least maxed out, if nothing else. But there was carbon-14 present, showing that it could not be millions of years old.
He says that what I'm guessing was a coal seam or something. He said that there was a lava flow of basalt that flowed through a forest, and so that there's a remnant of the forest there. I'm guessing it means coal, and that this was dated to 45,000 years by carbon because there's carbon in the forest, and it's beneath this the basalt that was dated to 45 million years. Are you aware of whatever the hell he's talking about?
Yeah, and this example actually came up in that debate, if you can call it, between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. Ken Ham raised this example. Bill Nye, understandably, had no idea what he was talking about, and it did prompt me to write a more in-depth article, like just looking at the geochemical results from those dating, and The short version is the wood itself. It doesn't date to 45,000 years. They're referring to what's essentially an infinite age radiocarbon date, where you can't tell the difference between, like, there's so little radiocarbon, you can't tell the difference between it being 50,000 years and 50 million years. It gives you essentially the same signal because all that radiocarbon is decayed away.
You know what the guy said? The guy said was that this was well within the range of what we should expect for carbon dating, which like maxes out at 50,000. And he says it's maxed out, right? But what you're talking about, that at this range it does max out. That from something that is 45,000 to 50,000 years is now in the unreliable, undetectable. That's where you just get noise.
Right. It depends on the nature of the sample, and for samples that old, you need to make sure it's in a fairly stable environment, and this definitely was not. It's a coal seam that's fractured open. I mean, there's a reason that they stumbled upon this sample. And coal is particularly difficult because of the way it can bind to more modern organic acids that are present in the groundwater. There's a high potential for getting some amount of contamination. And also in coal, there's a potential for neutron emissions from like uranium and elements in the surrounding matrix to produce radiocarbon from the nitrogen that's in the coal itself. And so we wouldn't expect, even if we had a coal sample we knew for sure is 300 million years old, we would expect there to be some non-zero amount of radiocarbon in there, even if there's no contamination. But add the element of the exposure to modern groundwater and organic acids, then there's no reason to think this is going to be absolutely radiocarbon dead. When I did look at those results, he said, I think he gave a finite age of about 45,000 years, but in reality, they're all over the place. And the multiple radiocarbon ages are more than a half-life different from one another, which tells you that whatever carbon is being measured, it's not intrinsic radiocarbon from the sample. It means that one part over here is more contaminated than the other. So they're all giving false ages, and those false ages only reflect the degree of contamination. It's just that in cases like this, I mean, radiocarbon is the last thing that you would use, I think, to try and constrain the age of this coal seam. Like, we know it's not going to work.
But what if your goal is to constrain the age? I'm sorry. That obviously the creationists are trying to find anything they can to make things as young as they can, and so they're going to use this.
You have a fair point. If your goal is to find confusing or conflicting results, this is exactly what you would do.
And so you're saying they came back with the carbon date and the error bars, saying that okay, it's within this, so it's within its calibrate, it's within its level of, and so therefore that shows that these methods are not very reliable. That's what it's showing.
Well, it says that, and to be fair, no serious scientist relies solely on a radiometric date.
Right.
For these very reasons, the uncertainty of the assumptions behind them. So geologists, for instance, would always do what they call a field survey. They will look at the layers of rock above and below the relevant sample, and if, for instance, it's above a layer which is generally accepted to be 200 million years old, and one of the results comes back more than 200 million, well, they'd reject that because it's above that layer. So it can't be that old, it must be younger. So there's other data which is brought to bear in interpreting the results.
Okay, yeah.
So when the published results come out, if a date is within what they expect, they'll publish it. If it's not too far out, it might appear as a footnote. But if it's completely whacked, they just drop it. Now, I'm not trying to be critical of scientists because I am one, but what it reveals is how our belief systems work, because we filter all the evidence we get in accordance with what we already believe. So if I've signed up for the naturalistic worldview, the evolutionary story, and there can be no creator, if I get a date which is just way out of court, like too young, for instance, I'll just reject it. I'll rationalise it away. Maybe there were impurities. Perhaps the lab equipment was not calibrated properly. It's a bit of an insult to the lab. Maybe the lab technician went for morning tea. I don't know. But whatever happened, something was wrong. Now, the problem is you've got a budget for your research project, and these results, these experiments are expensive, so you haven't got enough money to go and do it again.
Interesting.
So you cull your data. Now, that has an interesting effect. It means that everything that gets published aligns pretty closely with the paradigm. So the peer review system simply preserves the paradigm.
He says that the peer review process merely preserves the godless paradigm, specifically by not testing any anomalies, because that would be too expensive. So if something doesn't fit what we believe, then we simply ignore it and then don't test it.
It sounds like somebody who's never been through the peer review process, honestly. Our experience is exactly the opposite of that. In fact, there's a Facebook group dedicated to reviewer number 2 must be stopped, which I think reflects the sentiment of many researchers out there, where sometimes these reviews are quite harsh and they do want you to test the smallest anomaly to make sure that you didn't miss something. I mean, it's an annoying, sometimes frustrating system, but the end result is we do get to check a lot of our assumptions. It makes sure that we don't make any too gratuitous assumptions, that we haven't thought things through, and it's not 100% successful, but it's quite rigorous.
We've spent a bit of time talking about radiometric dating, which I think is really important, and actually there's probably a lot more reading that people can do on that. And again, we'd refer them to the website, creation.com. So let's go back to the evidences. What are the other evidences? So we've talked about actually radiometric dating. You can find rocks of a known age, and the radiometric dating gets it wrong. But what about other evidences for a young age?
Have you noticed how creationists pluralize a word that is already in the plural form? Where scientists will refer to a body of evidence or facts and evidence, believers say evidences. I'm beginning to think that the word evidences means rationalizations that are not actual facts or that don't really imply what they want it to due to some oversight on the believer's part.
Look, there's a lot of these. Let me just give you a few. And these are the sorts of things that people never hear about, right?
Yep.
The river systems around the world today dump about 20 billion tonnes of mud and sediment onto the ocean floor every year. Now, we can take an average depth of mud and sediment. We can calculate approximately how much is there. We know the rate at which it's being added to, so we can place an upper limit on the age of the ocean floor. And it turns out all of that sediment at the current rates, right? We're just taking a process, which we observed today, we're winding it backwards. And all of that would have got there in less than 12 million years.
Interesting.
Now, that's a disaster for the evolutionary story, because the oceans are supposed to be at least 3,000 million years old, not just 12. But then people might say, yes, but it's too long for the biblical account of only thousands of years. So you've got to go back to the historical record. So is there some event in the historical record in Genesis that might have dumped billions of tons of mud and sediment on the ocean floor? And you guessed it, the flood.
Right.
Yeah, he then uses the excuse for certain anomalies. He says, well, all of this can be explained if we assume that all geology is a result of the flood.
Yeah, which is, we know we can't. And that's quite simple to disprove. I mean, the rock strata has completely been dewatered, including stuff like clay, where water can't escape that fast. And so the fact that we have thick sequences of clay, which are by now pretty much water-free, it means that wasn't laid down in the last thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. We know that we know that this radioactive decay has occurred because we have all kinds of high abundances of daughter elements, evidence that the system has decayed, and they admit that. But we also know that that radioactive decay rate has not changed appreciably, certainly not by 6 orders of magnitude, because there's no evidence that those materials heated up to, especially to the point of melting and vaporizing. I mean, it's quite easy to dismiss his alternative here. He's just presenting a case where the geochemistry gets a little bit messy, But we know it gets messy in cases like that. That's why we avoid them. That's why we try to find those systems where the assumptions are likely to be held and where we can test those independently. And it takes, 5 minutes on Google Scholar. You could find 100 examples showing where that works completely fine.
Right. So when you have the true historical record of the history of the Earth, we have the basis on which we can interpret the evidence we see.
When you have the true historic record of the history of Earth, you can summarily dismiss young Earth creationism, and not just because we know and can show that the global flood of Noah's Ark never happened, and not just that it couldn't happen, but that we have proof that it didn't happen.
There are stacks of those. The rate at which the continents are being eroded would mean that the current continents would erode down to sea level in just 25 million years. How come they're still here? The Earth is supposed to be 4.5 billion years old, we're told. It's not consistent with the evolutionary story.
Now, can you speak to sedimentation rates? Because he argued that the rate of sedimentation would put all the continents in the sea within just 25 million years.
Yeah. It's another point on which this is another point that many, many years ago as a grad student prompted me to go to the library and find all of those old references. And the fun part about that is when I did find those references, the numbers they would give for their calculations half the time did not match what was in the original references, but they were counting on you never going to the library and finding those. The fact is, not only do they grossly overestimate those rates of sedimentation, and I'll come back to that point. The other part that is somewhat ignored is the tectonic cycle. The fact that sediments are constantly being subducted and recycled within the mantle. So the ocean is not a stagnant basin that's slowly accumulating mud and sand. That stuff is subducting back into the mantle, and then it's, you'll see it a few million years later as a volcanic eruption, for example. But in terms of the sedimentation rate, this is the same error that's made when they try to talk about the oceans being, not salty enough. Modern sedimentation rates and modern runoff rates for things like sodium are much higher today than they were even 200 years ago. What's changed since 200 years ago on the surface of the Earth? It's mainly land use changes by anthropogenic forces, by engineering, by agriculture, stuff like that, by damming rivers and controlling discharge along the major river pathways and so forth. This has a huge effect on sedimentation rates and on the geochemical cycles. And so sometimes what they do, I know they're willing to do, is take those anthropogenically modified rates and apply them back through time to where there would be no humans or at least no big giant construction projects and agriculture.
Outside of the Earth, looking into our solar system, people think that astronomy is, just a lay down misere of proof of evolutionary processes and vast age. The moons of Jupiter are absolutely fascinating. There's lots of those. Back in 2018, they discovered another 12. They were interesting because they were what are called retrograde moons. They orbit Jupiter in the reverse direction from all the others, which rotate around Jupiter in the same direction which Jupiter itself is spinning on its axis.
Yeah.
So that's a bit interesting. That's another story. But in this group of 12 going backwards, there's one going forwards. And so, in the article in the journals, the scientists said, this is an unstable situation. Head-on collisions would quickly occur and grind the objects down to dust. But they're not dust, they're still there.
Mm.
So just how long can you fly upstream in amongst all these other moons with an orbit that crosses their paths and not collide? So what it says is those moons orbiting Jupiter have not been there for 4.5 billion years, lucky to have been there for 1 million years.
Mm.
So it's a pointer to a recent creation.
No, it isn't. There's no reason why a magic invisible man would conjure something like this unless he just likes to deceive people. One of the advantages to having Jupiter and Saturn in our system is that they're more likely to capture some rogue worlds that might otherwise collide with our world. And these rogue worlds, these tiny moons, could come in from any direction at any time and might orbit the planet in any direction.
Now, the evolutionists can always make up a story, and they'll make up a story that says, well, maybe there was a collision nearby and the debris got captured in Jupiter's orbit and ended up in this nice circular group going the wrong way, except for one which is going the right way. But anyway, let's move on.
Number of specific collisions I think are needed, yeah.
It's a long bow to draw.
Yeah, got you.
And I don't think it's really a plausible explanation at all.
Wait, you think a plausible explanation would be that a magic invisible man said abracadabra?
Far more likely that the creator made it that way so that there's an indelible stamp of his creative genius on the moons of Jupiter, showing us that they were recently created.
There is no reason to pretend that the universe began and then immediately assumed its current condition, with every moon in its current place. And some of those are doubtless quite new, and they're at different altitudes with around a stunningly huge planet, so collisions are not as likely as you think.
Saturn's rings are decaying away at an alarming rate. The Cassini space probe passed through the rings multiple times towards the end of its life. And the results are that scientists believe, secular scientists, that the rings cannot be more than 400 million years old. So there's no really plausible model for how they formed. Here they are, and they're decaying rapidly. So there are some things that are very discordant with the evolutionary story.
No, none of that is discordant with evolution, nor does it have anything whatsoever to do with evolution. When rogue worlds do collide, as has evidently happened a bunch of times just in our system, they tend to explode into dust, which forms rings for a while. And then those rings fade with time. I wouldn't have expected them to last 400 million years. That's a long time. And maybe new rings will form from other similar collisions later on.
But things which perhaps are more directly related to the biblical age, look at the population of the world today. It's about 8 billion people, it was recently estimated. Do you know, when I was born, the Earth's population was 2.5 billion.
Wow.
And when I was doing my postgrad work, it was about 4 billion. And now it's 8 billion. So how long can we keep on projecting this? And you go backwards. Now, here's the problem, you see. If you look at the number of people that survived the flood, and there were 6 people who then populated the world, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's 3 sons and their wives, and let that population grow at the rate of about 0.5% for 4,500 years, you end up with 8 billion.
Just 0.5%, is that
That's
reasonable?
a very conservative growth rate. The growth rate today is more like 1% or even more.
Wow.
So more than sufficient to allow for things like wars, famines, and diseases. But if mankind had been on the planet for 100,000 years or more, where are all the people? We should be shoulder to shoulder on every square metre of the Earth's surface, including the ocean basins, and that wouldn't be enough.
Wow.
So it's not consistent with the idea that we've been on this planet for 100,000 years or perhaps even longer.
Sounds like you can't even go back 10 or 20,000 years. Just with I've not looked into the numbers, but just from what you're saying there.
Well, that's right, but it's quite consistent with the biblical timelines.
Yeah.
First off, at the time that you imagine this mythic flood that we know didn't happen, there were already civilizations still in existence in Egypt and Mesopotamia, China, and so on, with cultures established all over the world. Infant mortality was extremely high, life expectancy extremely low, and people died of smallpox and tetanus, infections, impacted wisdom teeth, autoimmune disorders, things that there was never a way to treat or even find out what was wrong with you. If I had been born just 100 years before I would have been dead 3 or 4 times before getting to this age. But then we have the advent of medicine and medical technology, sanitation, and so on, just within the last couple centuries or so. And that's when we see a sudden population explosion.
Another one which is very interesting, the discovery of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones and in fossils everywhere the remains of living things
Mm.
consistently show the presence of carbon-14. Carbon-14 has a relatively short half-life, about 5,700 years. So quick that you really would not expect to find or be able to detect carbon-14 for more than about maybe 60 to 80,000 years.
That's its maximum life or maximum time you can.
Yeah, but to
test
be
carbon.
able to, be down to maybe a molecule, and then that's going to ultimately decay away as well.
That'd be the daughter element. It would be
Yes.
so small you can't detect it.
It can't detect it. So the fact that carbon-14 is consistently found in organic material, fossils, says that they haven't been around for millions of years.
Mm.
Could only be a matter of thousands, but thousands is consistent with the Bible's record of history.
Mm.
I'm trying to think if you got anything. I didn't get quite to the end because I got into his personal testimonies yet, and that's just where I stopped. I didn't think he had any more evidences after that, but he does mention at one point he mentioned he says the fact that carbon-14 is consistently found in fossils.
Mm-hmm.
Says that they could not have existed they could only have existed for a few thousand years. They can't be millions of years old because carbon-14 is consistently found there.
Yeah, I honestly, I would like him to point to a single example where it is found in the fossils, and not just found like in the same material that also contains fossils, but what they've never been able to demonstrate is that radiocarbon is present in fossils, and that carbon derived from the actual organic material of the organism itself. You could take any geological sample and run it through an AMS radiocarbon analysis, and you're going to get some result. It's going to find some non-zero amount of radiocarbon. That's just the nature of the system, because you have these low-level backgrounds and interference. You have multiple means of introducing modern carbon during the sample preparation. That is known, it's accounted for, but it's not surprising that you get a non-zero amount of radiocarbon in any kind of analysis. But anytime they have attempted to radiocarbon date fossils, look at the results table carefully, and you'll find that they can never replicate those apparent ages. And the fact that you get ages from the same fossil coming back all over the place tells you that whatever carbon's being measured, it didn't come from the fossil or the organism itself.
Very good. Doctor, thank you very much for doing another one of these, because I mean, it seems to me that this. I made a video on this a couple days ago, how it's always the same arguments over and over again. You're talking to me today about things that you researched years ago as a result of the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate, or back when you were in college or whatever. You hear these creationist arguments, and now we're still dealing with the same arguments today that were refuted way back when. They don't care that it was refuted. They're going to keep repeating it, which is, I see as the real problem with creationism. They do not correct for their. They don't come up and say, you know what, this thing that we did from Mount St. Helens, that was improper, that was incorrect, we did everything wrong on purpose. We really should stop citing that one. But they're not going to stop citing that one, are they?
No, it's I'm always happy to come discuss it, and especially because there's a big disinformation balance here. And I realized this just today when I was checking for something on YouTube related to radiometric dating, and noticed that like the first 100 results are, radiometric dating debunked. This didn't work here, and there should be a very different ratio of disinformation to real information on this. And so I think we should commit ourselves to being, to more public information about this, so that people can recognize what's being done here, because they are quite tricky about it, to the point where it can be persuasive to not just the common listener, but even some more educated members of their audience. And because of that sophistication, it becomes difficult to counteract. But I mean, this it's not just.
That's one of the reasons I started my channel. One of the reasons I started my channel was when I start researching everything, All the websites that I was seeing, if you look up for transitional species or beneficial mutations, and there's certain keywords that the creationists have seized upon, and then they dominate with those keywords. Now, if you use the words the scientists, the terms that the scientists would actually use, then you're not going to find, that thing. They have to be the keyword form of it. But if you do look for that keyword, then you're just going to get swarmed with misinformation from websites. And then when YouTube came about, there's all of these videos on it too. So yeah, that was why I had to start producing content to try to balance, because professional scientists would, at the time when I started my channel, professional scientists they would just dismiss. They said, well, that doesn't matter. They don't know what they're talking about. It doesn't matter that they know that they don't know what they're talking about. You can't dismiss them for that. It is the misinformation campaign where they are absolutely dominating, and professional scientists, yourself being an exception, don't typically realize how they're being undermined by this propaganda campaign.
Yeah, I one day though they'll wake up and say, "Gosh, I don't know why the whole public is against me. They're against public education funding and against scientific research. And why are we suffering as a country? I just don't understand." And he said, "Well, like this began many decades ago, right? It's a trend, and what they've been able to do is create this echo chamber effect where the credibility is inflated because they hear from this creation.com video something about Mount St. Helens disproving radiometric dating, and then they go look it up and they find 20 or 30 more sources that also report this or something similar example, but what they don't find is a detailed explanation of what's going on there. They don't find a good detailed explanation of how those techniques work or how we test assumptions in radiometric dating. They just hear that word and then they kind of dismiss it. And because they see it everywhere, they believe it's true. And to their credit, like most of us function that way. If we see something 30 times, especially something that's not in our field or of expertise, then we might call it good and we're not going to research it further. Right. And so the problem is, they can easily come across 20 plus credible sources in their mind, and they're not going to be motivated to go beyond that. So, but there are plenty of folks out there. I mean, I still get emails today of, I came across your blog. I came across this article. I grew up in a homeschooled young earth creationist background, and everyone I trusted taught me this is how I should believe, and finally, found a way to understand scientifically what's happening here and the real measure of that evidence. And so it's quite encouraging that there are some people out there, they do stumble upon this and they take the time and they do understand it, and they're able to battle against that ingrained deception, right?
And thank you for your part in this battle. Thank you for being aware of what's going on and trying to do something about it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And when you correct for things like the effect of the flood, the dates one gets from carbon-14 dating actually contract. But that's another story we could go into. So there's a lot of these things which show that the evolutionary story really struggles to explain processes that we can observe today. And there are some of those which point very strongly to just thousands of years.
If there was something that evolution struggles to explain, why didn't you give us an example? Because all I know are things that creationism cannot explain, like the phylogeny challenge. What is a created kind? And how do you tell? Given 4 similar-looking animals, how can we tell if 2 of them are from the same kind and 2 others are from 2 different kinds? How do you know? What's the data? What are the indicating features? What have you? Let's actually explain that. Creationists try to dismiss macroevolution as if it's only microevolution, when you guys can't even show an example of micro-creation unless you pull a rabbit out of a hat. So what I see is science explains all these things, and creationism just says, "No, you don't really know what you know, so I can still make believe that maybe it was magic."